My guest today is Mark Thomas. Mark started his career in the US Army and then worked for a range of private sector companies and consultancies before setting up on his own 15 years ago. He's forged an enviable reputation as a consultant, trainer and speaker working in compliance and governance around the world. He's passionate about helping organizations find practical solutions to their challenges in governance, risk and compliance, and is now developing some guidance on ESG, environmental, social and governance. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Richard. It's good to be here.
So, how was your trip to the UK?
It's nice to travel internationally. It's been a couple of years since I've done it, but I can tell you, we were chatting about this earlier, that driving in London stresses me out for a couple of reasons. I'm driving on an opposite side of the road. And on top of that, there are so many rules and regulations that Americans don't know about that you have in London. But it's nice to be outside of the city, up here in High Wycombe with you.
Excellent. So ESG is a huge topic, but people have been working on corporate social responsibility programs and corporate governance programs for years. Mm-hmm. What is the difference? What's the difference about ESG to what's gone before?
So I think one of the big things is ES and G, to kind of give a background on this, is they've all been handled as separate parts in the past. You've had the environmental side, you've had the social side, and then you've got this thing on the other end called governance, which is supposed to be this umbrella over that. But I think we're starting to see ESG now be more powerful than the sum of these individual parts. Now, back in recently, we had the UN created what was called their 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and I believe that was a huge piece for us in the ESG market, because it really gained a lot of visibility into looking at this as a whole. Where environmental being things like, as an organization, am I thinking about the waste that we're producing? Am I thinking about sustainability? From the social side, are we thinking about internal and external? Being internal being more like my diversity, inclusion; external being, am I a steward to the community in which I operate? And so now we're seeing these kind of combined, and so I believe that's why we're seeing an increased awareness here, because again, the sum of its parts. We're seeing more organizations and countries now looking at this, and I think it had a lot to do with the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah. But what does it really mean for organizations? Won't ESG sort of flow through all parts of the organization? Is it going to be something similar to the recent movement in industrial companies about safety first? Is it something that everybody in the organization has got to get behind, and it's going to affect? Or is it a C-suite endeavor?
We've seen this with a lot of what people call trends and fads lately, especially over the last probably 2 decades. But I'll tell you this. My observation is like continual improvement. We say it's everybody's job. Well, in an organization, if something is everyone's job, nobody's doing it. And so I truly believe there needs to be a nucleus or an effort that really has visibility of these pieces that are taking place across an organization with respect to ES and G. But there are a couple of approaches, and a lot of it depends on the structures and the culture of the organization. One of those is the camp that says we need to have another committee. We need to have an ESG committee, and they need to focus on that, and they need to push ESG down the ranks. And the other camp, which I tend to agree with a little bit more, that says we do need to have a nucleus, right? Some group or some individual or process that evaluates, directs, and monitors our efforts, but it should be ingrained into every part of work. And that starts at the board of directors or whatever the equivalent is of an organization, especially small to medium-sized enterprises. That's typically your ownership, right? But if we can ingrain that down into the tasks and activities of the workforce so that, my goals, right? My individual goals are linked somehow. There's a portion of that might be linked to my ability to support our ESG goals in the organization. So I do see that as really being part of the fabric of an organization rather than having another committee. We get committed out. That's our solution to everything. When people think governance, they think this is just committees. Well, again, governance has to be through the whole organization.
So, Mark, your whole last 15 years in private practice, when you've been advising organizations around the world, your main focus has been on governance. and particularly advising C-suites on what they should do about operational governance, IT governance. So where was your road to Damascus to look at environmental and social elements
called ESG.
and think, actually, I can make a difference. I can make a difference by helping organizations look at this wider view. What was the trigger? What got you into this game?
This hasn't been long ago. It's actually been since the coronavirus started. So you know that I grew up on the IT governance side and around a lot of more technically focused frameworks. Well, I advised several boards as an external advisor from an IT governance perspective, and I was part of a board meeting, and I was asked directly by one of the committee chairs, Mark, what is this ESG thing, and what does it have to do with IT governance? And it was interesting because it was completely out of the blue. And so, of course, I can't answer that directly at the board. I said, let me get back to you on this because I think there's something here. So when I started doing research on ESG, initially my passion was, what can we do from an IT governance or IT systems to assist in that? And there was a lot of information out there about, we have AI, we have data warehousing, we have a lot of new technologies that allow us to do this. That's how I moved into really more looking at ESG as a fundamental part of a governance structure and organization. Because in every one of these areas that I've seen, technology can help. Technology can help us from an environmental perspective, and in some cases, technology is creating waste in some cases. Cell phones being thrown away, right? That's creating some of the problems, but technology can also help us solve these problems. From a social side, really, it's really more around, understanding the data collection and be able to analyze and understand the impacts of these. So that's how it got into the overarching ESG piece. And with two of the boards that I actually advise now, I've actually moved from being the external IT governance and cybersecurity advisor to the person to call when they have a question about environmental and social governance, because they're trying to integrate this into their overarching system. So it's been a pretty interesting journey, and it's gone quick.
Is there a global standard? Is there something that I can pick up and say, this is what best practice looks like, or is that emerging?
Yeah, not yet. So we're seeing this in small pockets. There are certain parts of the globe that are a little more focused on it than others are. But there's not a single global standard out there that I'm aware of. And I want to be careful about saying standard. There's best practice guidance, like you said. There are some things in the works. I actually am working with a colleague of mine, working on kind of really more of an architectural reference framework right now, because what we're trying to do is separate the idea that I'm using it for investment, and what we're trying to do is put something together for organizations to say, what is ESG and what can we be doing in this organization to do that? So I think we're going to see a lot of them come up in the next 1 to 3 years. Like I said, we're seeing a lot of smaller ones pop out there. But it wouldn't surprise me, Richard, if we didn't in the next few years see some type of global initiative around compliance on this, similar to what we might have seen with, say, GDPR. It wouldn't surprise me if there weren't enough collaboration for that to take place. But I think that's going to take quite some time. But I think what we really need right now is that framework and working on that information right now.
I hope an ESG approach is more successful than GDPR, because I do think that we're seeing the segmentation now, aren't we? The fracturing of some basic principles on GDPR.
We really are.
Making global business very difficult.
Yeah, it is. And you kind of hit it when you talked about checking boxes. And that's what's happened to a lot of organizations. And my response is to do this because it's the right thing to do, because over time it helps your organization actually become more sustainable and more profitable. Yeah.
I can remember the quality movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and ISO 9000 arrived and the boards of directors embraced it, companies embraced it. The whole concept, though, behind ISO 9000 was continuous improvement. Mm-hmm. But it soon got stuck where people would say, well, we've actually got signed off for ISO 9000. We're not going to change anything because we might lose our accreditation. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So let's stick with what we got. Is there a danger that ESG is going to be something that once an organization's got an ESG model, process or documentation in place, the concept of continuing improvement gets put on the back burner? And so people slavishly follow the method they have, tick the boxes, say they're compliant. The audit committee comes along and says, yeah, you're all compliant, tick in the box.
Yeah.
Everything's going all very well.
Yeah.
And you lose the value of it. Is that a fear? Or
Is it possible? Yes. The desire here is to have ESG into the fabric of an organization and become business as usual. And I think a lot of things we saw, especially with the continuous improvement and a lot of the things we saw kind of fizzle away, organizations failed to monitor their performance indicators. And what they will do is have these specific goals and objectives. Hey, quality is number one. Well, then that falls off the priority list when digital transformation shows up or some new compliance requirement shows up. So a point you made, Richard, I think is really key to ESG. You talk about ticking boxes, and if an organization just wants to check boxes, right, and they can be compliant, that's one thing. But to be performing in an organization and to be kind of considered a good steward of the environment, to have good social responsibility, I think needs to be ingrained into that organization. So could it happen? Yes. I do have some ideas and thoughts on how we might be able to help that through, of course, the goals cascade and organizations, really identifying these as corporate values. And I think that will help a lot.
So you mentioned the goals cascade. The goals cascade is part of the ISACA portfolio, isn't it? That within a number of the ISACA products, there's this goals cascade that comes down through the organization, depending on where you are. So do you see ESG policies and approaches fitting into existing governance frameworks, or do you think we're going to see the rise of the ESG framework that is the best framework since the last best framework we had?
So I always have this joke about framework overload, and I know APMG has been very deep in the certifications and the training of these, but I don't think we need a framework that answers every single question for just ESG. My personal belief and my professional opinion is we need to have something that really augments current governance structures. Take, for example, ISO 27000. One of the latest documents out there from guidance from International Standards Organization. You look at the basic concepts of ISO 27000, and there are parts of this standard that can easily adopt your ESG efforts, and so I think that's kind of an important piece there. But when you think about frameworks and those kinds of things, again, as soon as we see a framework, we want to be checkbox compliant, and it's really difficult. But I will say that having training is very important when it comes to not just frameworks, but any type of architectural reference or those kinds of things to that. So yeah, we're going to see how this rolls out. Right now, today, that I'm aware of, there is no single framework that exists for ESG. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of small pockets of guidance from consulting firms and major software service providers, but we're not seeing one that really focuses on kind of an overall holistic view. One of the challenges we're running into right now is when you asked earlier about how do we make this front and center in front of organizations. Well, what we're starting to see is the investment community is doing that for us, and the investment community is saying, hey, well, we're only going to give you advice on investing in ESG friendly companies. So there's some criteria that are used to do that. But what's challenging for organizations is I want to know what I need to do to truly do the right thing when it comes to my environmental and social governance, not because I want to make sure my stock price goes up. Now, is that great? That's a reason that an organization exists. But I do want to make sure that we're doing this from a sustainability perspective.
But do you think there's going to be one of these requirements on my suppliers? So are all suppliers going to have to demonstrate that they have an ESG policy or approach internally, or are they going to have to demonstrate that they comply with the requirements of the hosting organization? So if you take some of the huge US companies, so if you take someone like Boeing, is a supplier to Boeing going to have to comply with what Boeing think is an ESG policy, or are they going to be able to demonstrate that within their own ecosystem, in their own part of the business, they are applying the principles of ESG, and they have their own policy. Because if everybody has to, if everyone has to align with the top dog, they're going to have to align with so many organisations. There's going to be bureaucracy and box ticking gone mad. How do you think this could evolve so it's user-friendly, relevant, and in particular supplier-friendly?
So I think it's a good point that we need to look at the complete supply chain. When we look at it from an organizational perspective, I think about risk. And the question I will ask a lot of organizations is, are you okay when you make the front page of the newspaper because one of your suppliers is using extremely illegal and unethical practices in another country? Are you prepared to be on the newspaper for that? Of course, the answer is no. We can't control that depth of the supply chain, and that's why I think having a broad amount of information for organizations to say, look, we're not focusing just on check the box, but what we're focusing on is doing the right thing and looking at your environmental and social aspects, and just by having that program in place, by and large, you will be quote unquote compliant. Now, there's no such thing as compliance right now to ESG globally, but I certainly wouldn't be surprised if that happened at some point.
So if you take that compliance argument, I mean, we've had some cases over here where some of the big audit companies have signed off audits on companies, and the company's then gone bust. And it's gone bust in a fairly short period of time. So there's currently an issue with how much a company's prepared to spend on audit and for auditors to actually go and do the job. So if we're looking at ESG and we're looking at ESG through supply chains, do you think it's possible to have some checks and balances in that, or do you think it's going to be a matter of trust through the supply chain? Where do you stand on what was the famous phrase from one of your presidents? Trust but verify.
Trust but verify. Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. And there's a reason why, right? There's a reason why we have speeding laws. There's a reason why we have different rules and regulations. And I think when we're looking at audit, what we're trying to do is I want to make sure that I understand my posture when it comes to external requirements and regulations. From an internal audit perspective, I do want to make sure, though, that I have the proper controls in place to help me meet my goals and objectives. And I think that's the key piece here, is kind of linking back to that goals cascade. When you look at how you integrate ESG and really try to balance this performance and conformance between these two pieces, I think there are a couple of key things we need to think of first. Number one is, what is your strategy? Right? What type of organization are you? There could be different ESG posture for a bicycle manufacturer than there might be for an international banking system, right? Different supply chains altogether. So I think look at your strategy and the type of organization, and of course your goals cascade. What are your goals? Because if you have your organizational vision statement and identify goals and objectives, there should be some reference to your position on environmental and social governance. And I truly believe that. So you might recall the balanced scorecard, right? And I link this back to that goals cascade. Think about the balanced scorecard, been around for 3-4 decades now. And the whole idea was this, is that we're balancing the way we organize our goals, objectives, and our metrics and measures. And we're doing that financially. We're doing that from a customer perspective, internal, and innovation. Why can't there be another portion of a balanced scorecard that is our ESG posture? Because I do know, having worked in a lot of organizations, when we build our goals for, say, your goals, right? Your goals should be aligned with your higher organization's goals, and the organizations that work for you should be aligned with that. Maybe there's another dimension of the balanced scorecard. It sounds crazy, but that would help us integrate this thinking from top to bottom. And therefore, when we look from a cultural perspective, is there may be a recognition and a reward system in place for this. Not that we pay somebody a bonus check because they're environmentally friendly, but a recognition system so that we know, as an individual and organization, I'm making the decisions that, one, meet my personal ethics, but number two, kind of meet the code of conduct of the enterprise.
It's interesting you say that, because it also brings me on to my final question, which is about organizations today are going leaner. They're trying to be more resilient. We've got the whole debate going on about remote team working and whether people need to come back to the office or whether they work from home. So with those trends in the workplace and with ESG coming over the hill, moving from the investment community to the operational community, if you like, how do you see those things working? Do you see ESG is part of that theme of resilience of lean and appropriate working, or do you see it as something being contrary to that?
Well, with a lean organization, not necessarily lean organization to me doesn't mean it's a small to medium enterprise, but lean means, we can make a left-hand turn fast. But I will also say that in lean organizations, we are generally cost concerned, and adopting an ESG program is not zero. Right. There are money, there's resources available in that. And I think the challenges for lean organizations is, what is the business case for us? There's no legal or compliance requirement for my size of organization to do this. We see this with things like privacy and so on. Hey, we don't have the transaction volume, so we're not under the jurisdiction of, say, GDPR. So I think that's going to be a challenge for a lot of organizations. So it comes down to, I believe, two things: is training and awareness on why ESG is the right thing. And I'm not being an activist saying this. I'm saying it is a good thing. The ESG movement isn't saying, oh, well, humans are the cause of everything, right? It's saying, how are we going to make things better in the future for the environment, and how do we have more diversity, equity, inclusion? So back to the point of small to more lean types of organizations, I think it's training and awareness, because over time, and there aren't a lot of studies out on this now, but the studies that I've seen show over time the organization can be more profitable, can be more efficient, can have better retention and customer satisfaction. And as a lean organization, the voice of the customer is what I'm focusing on. So I think that is a big thing. And of course, the culture side. In a lean organization, it's relatively flat. Communication moves very, very quickly. So tone at the top is going to be huge for those organizations.
Mark, fascinating talking to you. I'm sure we could actually talk for hours on this subject. Many thanks for finding the time to fit in this podcast during your very busy schedule.
Thanks for having me.
Talking to you.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Richard.